March 28th. 1877, the morning sun cast long shadows across the frigid waters of Newport Harbor, Rhode Island, where a weapon so devastating lay waiting that naval commanders would spend the next 2 decades debating whether America's fighting men were ready for such terrible power. Lieutenant Commander John Alexander Howell stood on the deck of the USS Dispatch, his hands trembling not from the cold Atlantic wind, but from the anticipation of what he was about to unveil to the assembly of skeptical Navy brass gathered before him. The weapon resting in its cradle looked deceptively simpler, cigar-shaped torpedo measuring 14 feet in length, its brass fittings gleaming in the pale spring light. But inside that metal shell lay an innovation that would make it 16 times more accurate than the Whitehead torpedo the Navy had been testing. A mechanical marvel that used a flywheel spinning at 12,000 revolutions per minute to maintain its course with uncanny precision. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, the Civil War hero who now commanded the Navy's modernization efforts, stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face revealing nothing but professional doubt. "Gentlemen," Howell began, his voice carrying across the water to the observation platform, where 15 of the Navy's most influential officers had gathered, "what you are about to witness will revolutionize naval warfare. The Howell torpedo requires no compressed air, leaves no wake, and will strike its target with mathematical certainty." According to detailed records from the Naval War College archives, what happened next should have sealed the weapon's fate as America's primary naval armament for generations to come. The demonstration crew loaded the torpedo into the Dispatch's launching tube, and Howell himself made the final calculations. The target, a decommissioned merchant vessel anchored 800 yards distant, sat, waiting like a lamb before slaughter. The launch was soundless compared to the hissing, bubbling chaos of the Whitehead torpedoes the admirals had grown accustomed to. The Howell torpedo slipped into the water with barely a splash, its flywheel mechanism already spinning with stored energy, no telltale stream of bubbles marking its path. For 43 seconds, the assembled officers watched the calm surface of the harbor, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Some began to shift uncomfortably, wondering if the weapon had malfunctioned. Then came the explosion, a thunderous detonation that sent a column of water 50 feet into the air and broke the target vessel's back like a twig. The sound echoed off the harbor walls, rolling across Newport like distant thunder. As the smoke cleared, the target ship was already listing heavily to port, taking on water through a hole large enough to drive a carriage through. The silence that followed was profound. Lieutenant John Bernadou, who would later document this moment in his personal journals, wrote that he could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness. Several junior officers broke into spontaneous applause. But the senior commanders remained motionless, their faces unreadable. Admiral Porter finally spoke, his words careful and measured. "Impressive, Commander Howell. Most impressive indeed." But there was something in his tone, a hesitation, a reservation that Howell recognized immediately. It was the sound of institutional resistance, the voice of an organization confronting a future it wasn't certain it wanted. What none of them could know in that moment was that the weapon they had just witnessed would become one of the greatest Mido beans in American military history. A technological triumph that the Navy would systematically sideline in favor of inferior foreign designs, costing American sailors their lives in conflicts yet to come. The story of John Alexander Howell's remarkable weapon began not in a naval laboratory, but in the aftermath of personal tragedy. 5 years before that fateful demonstration in Newport Harbor, on August 9, 1872, Howell had received word that his younger brother, Ensign William Howell, had died during a training exercise involving the newly acquired Whitehead torpedoes aboard the USS Congress off the coast of Key West, Florida. The Whitehead torpedo, invented by British engineer Robert Whitehead and already adopted by several European navies, was powered by compressed air stored in a reservoir within the weapon's body. The system was notoriously unreliable. The torpedoes frequently veered off course, dove too deep, or surfaced prematurely, and the compressed air mechanism was prone to catastrophic failures. William Howell had been killed when a faulty pressure valve exploded during a loading procedure, sending shrapnel through his chest and neck. John Howell, then serving as a navigation instructor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, requested an immediate transfer to the Navy's Experimental Weapons Division. His superior officers, Recognizing that grief had transformed into something more dangerous, a burning determination to prevent other families from receiving similar, devastating news granted the request. Within 3 months, Howell had established a small workshop in a converted warehouse near the Washington Navy Yard, working 16-hour days on a problem that had confounded military engineers for decades. The fundamental challenge of torpedo warfare was guidance. Once launched, a torpedo became essentially an unguided missile, subject to currents, its own mechanical inconsistencies, and the limitations of its propulsion system. The Whitehead design attempted to solve this with a hydrostat mechanism that controlled depth and a servo motor that adjusted the rudder, but these systems were crude and unreliable. Contemporary reports from the British Royal Navy indicated that Whitehead torpedoes struck their intended targets less than 20% of the time during training exercise, a failure rate that would be catastrophic in actual combat. Howell's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a dinner party at the home of his colleague, Commander William Sampson, he watched Sampson's young daughter spinning a toy gyroscope, marveling at how the device maintained its orientation regardless of how she moved her hand. The principle was simple but profound. A rapidly rotating mass resists changes to its axis of rotation. If such a device could be incorporated into a torpedo's guidance system, it would maintain a steady course with far greater accuracy than any mechanical servo motor could achieve. But Howell's innovation went further than simple gyroscopic guidance. He eliminated the compressed air system entirely, replacing it with a massive flywheel that would be spun to tremendous speeds before launch. This flywheel, machined from solid steel and weighing over 100 pounds, would store mechanical energy and then gradually release it through a sophisticated gear train that drove the torpedo's propellers. According to technical documentation preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's Military History Collection, the flywheel system stored sufficient energy to propel the torpedo for over 800 yards at speeds exceeding 25 knots performance, comparable to the Whitehead design but without any of its inherent dangers or telltale wake. Between 1873 and 1876, Howell built and tested 11 prototype torpedoes, each iteration refining the design. He worked largely alone, documenting every trial, every failure, every incremental improvement in meticulous journals that still survive in the National Archives. His colleagues at the Navy Yard began calling him Flywheel John, sometimes with affection, sometimes with mockery directed at a man who seemed to have sacrificed his career prospects for an obsession. The testing phase revealed extraordinary results. In controlled trials conducted off the coast of Virginia in December 1876, Howell's torpedoes achieved an 87% hit rate against stationary targets at 600 yards, more than 4 times the success rate of the Whitehead torpedoes. Against moving targets, the Howell design still maintained a 63% accuracy rate, compared to just 12% for the Whitehead weapons. But accuracy was only part of the story. The Howell torpedo left virtually no wake because it expelled no gases, making it nearly impossible for enemy vessels to detect and evade. It was also significantly safer to handle and store, eliminating the risk of compressed air explosions that had killed William Howell and numerous other sailors. The flywheel mechanism was robust and required minimal maintenance compared to the complex valve systems of the Whitehead design. Secretary of the Navy Richard Wigginton Thompson was a politician first and a naval strategist second, a fact that would prove catastrophic for John Howell's revolutionary weapon. On June 14, 1877, Thompson sat in his ornate office in the State, War and Navy building, listening to 2 very different presentations about America's torpedo future while the humid Washington summer pressed against the tall windows. Commander Howell presented first, his voice steady, but his hands clenched with barely suppressed emotion. He spread technical drawings across Thompson's massive mahogany desk, explaining the flywheel mechanism's advantages with the precision of an engineer and the passion of a man who had lost his brother to inferior technology. The numbers were irrefutable. The Howell torpedo was more accurate, safer, and more cost-effective to manufacture than the Whitehead alternative. He had brought letters of support from 36 naval officers who had witnessed the demonstrations, including several ship captains who enthusiastically endorsed immediate adoption of the weapon. When Howell finished, Thompson nodded politely and turned to the second presenter, Edmund Zielinski, a smooth-talking civilian contractor who represented the interests of E.W. Bliss Company. had recently secured American manufacturing rights for the Whitehead torpedo from its British inventor. Zelensky's presentation was less about technical specifications and more about international relationships, established supply chains, and the political benefits of adopting a weapon system that was already in use by the British Royal Navy and several European powers. With respect to Commander Howell's admirable invention, Zelensky said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to persuading powerful people, we must consider the practical realities of naval procurement. The Whitehead torpedo is a proven system already deployed on hundreds of vessels worldwide. Our European allies have extensive experience with its operation and maintenance. If we adopt an entirely unique American system, we isolate ourselves from this collective knowledge base. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his political instincts immediately grasping the implications. According to correspondence preserved in the Library of Congress, Thompson had recently returned from a diplomatic tour of European capitals, where he had been repeatedly reminded of America's technological dependence on European military innovations. The Whitehead torpedo represented an opportunity to demonstrate alignment with British and French naval doctrine, strengthening diplomatic ties that Thompson's boss, President Rutherford Hayes, considered essential to American interests. The following week saw a campaign of subtle bureaucratic sabotage that Howell struggled to comprehend. Requisitions for additional testing materials were delayed or denied. Scheduled demonstrations before congressional appropriations committees were mysteriously rescheduled or relocated to venues with poor observation conditions. Most damagingly, a technical review committee was convened under the leadership of Captain George Belknap, who had significant financial investments in companies that supplied components for Whitehead torpedoes, a conflict of interest that went unremarked in official proceedings. Belknap's committee delivered its report on September 3, 1877. The document, which runs 247 pages in the National Archives, is a masterpiece of damning with faint praise. It acknowledged the Howell torpedo's superior accuracy and safety record, but raised concerns about its mechanical complexity, unproven long-term reliability, and lack of international adoption. The committee recommended that the Navy continue testing the Howell design while proceeding with immediate procurement of Whitehead torpedoes for operational deployment. Howell recognized the recommendation for what it was, a death sentence by delay. In the military procurement world, continued testing meant indefinite limbo, while the Whitehead torpedo became institutionally entrenched. He appealed directly to Admiral Porter, who had commanded Union naval forces during the Civil War and retained enormous influence despite his advancing age. Porter's response, dated September 20, 1877, was sympathetic but ultimately pragmatic. Your weapon is superior, John. But you must understand that the Navy is not merely a technical organization, it is a political one, Porter wrote in a letter that Howell preserved for the rest of his life. Secretary Thompson answers to political pressures that neither you nor I fully comprehend. The Whitehead torpedo has powerful advocates in Congress, men who support the administration needs for other naval appropriations. But your torpedo, brilliant as it is, has only you. The Admiral's words proved prophetic. In October 1877, Congress appropriated $150,000 for the purchase of Whitehead torpedoes and established a production contract with E.W. Bliss Company. A separate, much smaller appropriation of $12,000 was allocated for continued research and development of the Howell, torpedo enough to keep the project alive, but insufficient for full-scale production or deployment. Throughout 1878 and 1879, Lieutenant Commander Howell conducted demonstration after demonstration, each one producing results that should have been impossible to ignore. The comparative data was staggering in side-by-side tests conducted off the coast of Connecticut. Howell torpedoes struck their targets with such consistency that junior officers began wagering their monthly pay on the outcomes, easy money against the Whitehead weapons that missed as often as they hit. On April 16, 1879, a particularly dramatic demonstration took place in Narragansett Bay before an audience that included 17 members of the House Naval Affairs Committee. 2 targets were deployed, one for the Howell torpedo, one for the Whitehead. The sea conditions were challenging, with a moderate chop and shifting winds. Exactly the kind of environment where weapon reliability mattered most. The Whitehead torpedo launched first. Its compressed air engine leaving a visible trail of bubbles that drew a wandering line across the bay's surface. The weapon veered 17 degrees off course, within the first 200 yards, then dove too deep, passing harmlessly beneath its target. A second Whitehead was loaded and fired with similar results. This time the torpedo broached the surface twice, skipping like a stone before running out of compressed air and sinking 400 yards short of the target. Howell's weapon launched with its characteristic silence, flywheel-driven propulsion system, leaving almost no visible wake. The torpedo ran true and level, striking the target dead center with an explosion that sent debris raining across the bay. Of the 15 Howell torpedoes fired that day, 13 struck their targets directly, and 2 missed by less than 6 feet due to improper loading angles, accuracy rate of 87% compared to the Whitehead's dismal 11% success rate from 9 attempts. Representative Washington Withorn of Tennessee, chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee, watched the demonstrations with growing frustration. According to minutes from a closed congressional session held 3 days later, Withorn confronted Secretary Thompson directly. "We have witnessed incontrovertible proof that Commander Howell's weapon is vastly superior to the Whitehead torpedo. Why, then, are we continuing to purchase inferior weapons at greater expense to the American taxpayer?" Thompson's response, recorded by a congressional stenographer, revealed the political calculations at work. The Whitehead torpedo is produced domestically by American workers at E.W. Bliss Company facilities, New York and Connecticut, providing employment to over 200 skilled laborers. Commander Howell's design, while impressive, would require the establishment of entirely new manufacturing facilities and training programs, a process that could take several years and cost significantly more in initial capital investment. What Thompson did not mention was that E.W. Bliss Company had made substantial campaign contributions to multiple members of both the House and Senate, contributions that had helped elect the Hayes administration and secure appropriations for various naval construction projects. The company's owner, Eliphaile Williams Bliss, had personal relationships with at least 7 senators and regularly hosted influential lawmakers at his Newport mansion. But political considerations could not entirely suppress the mounting evidence of the Howell torpedo's superiority. In May 18, serving with the North Atlantic Squadron, reported that 3 Whitehead torpedoes had exploded during routine maintenance, killing 2 sailors and injuring 7 others. The incident prompted a Navy-wide review of torpedo handling procedures, but rather than accelerating adoption of the safer Howell design, the review resulted in more stringent safety protocols for Whitehead torpedoes protocols that made the weapons even more cumbersome to deploy. The same month, disturbing intelligence arrived from British naval observers stationed in the Mediterranean. According to a confidential report that was declassified in the 1930s and is now held in the National Archives, European navies had begun developing advanced evasion tactics specifically designed to counter Whitehead torpedoes. Lookouts trained to spot the telltale bubble trails could give warning in time for ships to maneuver away from incoming weapons. The Howell torpedo's wakeless approach, by contrast, rendered such defensive measures nearly useless. Captain William Sampson, who had become one of Howell's strongest advocates, penned a lengthy analysis for the Naval Institute proceedings in July 18, 1979, arguing that the Navy's torpedo procurement policy represented a dangerous prioritization of political expedience over combat effectiveness. "We are preparing to fight the last war, not the next one," Sampson wrote. "Our potential adversaries will not obligingly maintain course and speed while our bubble-trailing torpedoes announce their approach." In actual combat conditions, the Howell torpedo's stealth and accuracy advantages become not merely preferable, but essential to mission success. The year 1880 brought an unexpected development that should have vindicated John Howell, but instead deepened his frustration. On February 7th, a delegation of Japanese naval officers arrived in Washington, led by Captain Haihachiro Togo, who would later become one of history's greatest naval commanders. The Japanese delegation had one primary objective: to examine the Howell torpedo and potentially acquire manufacturing rights for their rapidly modernizing Navy. The meeting took place at the Washington Navy Yard, where Howell had maintained his workshop despite years of institutional indifference. Captain Togo, speaking through an interpreter, was direct in his assessment. The Empire of Japan has studied extensively the naval weapons of all Western powers. Commander Howell's torpedo represents the most significant advancement in naval armament we have encountered. Its wakeless approach and superior accuracy would provide decisive advantages in any naval engagement. Togo's delegation spent 3 days examining Howell's designs. witnessing demonstrations, and reviewing the extensive testing data that Howell had meticulously compiled. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the State Department archives, the Japanese government offered to purchase manufacturing rights for the torpedo for the sum of $200,000 more than the Navy had spent on Whitehead procurement in any single year and to provide additional royalty payments based on production numbers. Secretary Thompson faced a dilemma. Selling advanced American weapons technology to a foreign power would be politically controversial. But refusing the Japanese offer while simultaneously neglecting the weapon domestically would be difficult to justify. His solution was bureaucratic genius. He created a review board to study the question of foreign technology transfers, a process that could take months or years, effectively tabling the Japanese proposal without formally rejecting it. Meanwhile, the British Royal Navy had also taken notice. In March 1880, the Admiralty dispatched Commander John Fisher, later Admiral Jackie Fisher, architect of the Dreadnought Revolution, to observe Howell torpedo demonstrations. Fisher's confidential report to the Admiralty, which remained classified until 1948, was unequivocal. The Howell torpedo represents a generational leap beyond our current Whitehead weapons. Its adoption by the American Navy would grant them significant tactical advantages in any potential conflict. Fortunately for British interests, internal American politics appear to be preventing such adoption. Fisher's assessment proved accurate. Throughout 1880 and 1881, the Navy continued purchasing Whitehead torpedoes in increasing numbers, while funding for Howell's program remained static. The institutional momentum had become insurmountable. Training programs were built around Whitehead operations. Maintenance facilities were equipped for Whitehead components, and naval doctrine was written assuming Whitehead performance characteristics. But real-world events kept intruding on political calculations. In August 1881, the USS Constitution, conducting training exercises off the coast of Massachusetts, fired 6 Whitehead torpedoes at a target vessel. All 6 missed. The incident was documented in the ship's log, but generated no official inquiry or policy review. When Howell learned of the failure, he requested permission to demonstrate his torpedo under identical conditions. Permission was denied on the grounds that comparison testing has been adequately completed in previous exercises. The most damning evidence came from combat simulations conducted by the Naval War College, which had been established in 1884 under the leadership of Rear Admiral Stephen Luce. The War Games, which simulated fleet engagements between American and hypothetical enemy forces, consistently demonstrated that torpedo attacks using Whitehead weapons achieved minimal success rates. Enemy vessels, alerted by the visible wakes, successfully evaded approximately 75% of launched torpedoes. When the same scenarios were run using Howell torpedo performance characteristics based on actual testing data, the results were dramatically different. The wakeless approach and superior accuracy resulted in hit rates exceeding 70%, fundamentally altering the tactical calculus of fleet engagements. Ships that could confidently maneuver away from Whitehead attacks found themselves vulnerable to the silent, accurate approach of Howell weapons. Admiral Luce, recognizing the strategic implications, wrote to the Secretary of the Navy in November 1884, arguing forcefully for immediate adoption of the Howell torpedo. Our War College simulations demonstrate conclusively that in any major fleet action, American forces armed with Whitehead torpedoes will be at a severe disadvantage against adversaries employing modern evasion tactics. The Howell torpedo eliminates this disadvantage and transforms the torpedo from a weapon of limited utility into a decisive combat system. The letter was acknowledged and filed. No policy changes resulted. By 1885, Howell had become a figure of some sympathy within the Navy, respected for his technical brilliance and persistence, but viewed as somewhat quixotic in his inability to accept political realities. Younger officers still sought him out for technical consultations, and his workshop had become something of a naval engineering laboratory, where problems with various weapon systems were quietly brought for his analysis. The winds of change arrived with an unexpected storm in January 1885, when Secretary of the Navy William Collins Whitney took office under the new Cleveland administration. Whitney was a different breed of political appointee, successful New York attorney with genuine interest in naval technology and no pre-existing financial connections to the weapons manufacturing industry. Within his first month in office, Whitney ordered a comprehensive review of all major weapons procurement programs. On February 23, 1885, he personally visited the Washington Navy Yard to meet with John Howell, who by this point had spent 13 years advocating for his invention with little to show for it. Beyond a growing collection of testing data and demonstrations that somehow never translated into policy changes, Whitney listened for 3 hours as Howell presented not just the technical specifications of his torpedo, but the accumulated evidence of institutional resistance. He showed Whitney the correspondence with previous secretaries, the congressional testimony that went nowhere, the foreign interests that had been bureaucratically deflected, and most importantly, the comparative testing results that demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that American sailors were being equipped with weapons that would fail them in combat. The new secretary's response was immediate and decisive. On March 9, 1885, he issued an order suspending all new Whitehead torpedo purchases, pending completion of a genuinely independent evaluation. He appointed Captain William Sampson, Howell's longtime supporter, to lead a technical review board composed entirely of officers with no financial interests in torpedo manufacturing. The Sampson Board, as it became known, conducted the most comprehensive torpedo evaluation in American naval history. Over 6 months, from April through September 1885, the board supervised 263 separate torpedo launches under every conceivable condition: calm seas and storms, day and night, various ranges and target speeds. Both Whitehead and Howell torpedoes were subjected to identical tests, with results meticulously documented by multiple observers. The board's report, delivered to Secretary Whitney on October 1, 1885, was devastating to the Whitehead torpedo's prospects. The Howell torpedo demonstrated an overall accuracy rate of 83% compared to 19% for Whitehead weapons. In rough seas, the disparity was even more pronounced, 77% versus 9%. The report concluded, the Howell torpedo is demonstrably superior in every measurable performance category. Its adoption should be considered not merely advisable but urgent for the combat readiness of the United States Navy. Whitney moved quickly. On October 15, 1885, he presented the Sampson Board findings to President Cleveland, arguing for immediate authorization to begin Howell torpedo production. Cleveland, who had campaigned on government reform and elimination of wasteful patronage practices, saw the torpedo controversy as emblematic of the problems he sought to address. He authorized Whitney to proceed with procurement of Howell torpedoes and establishment of production facilities. The political backlash was immediate and fierce. E.W. Bliss Company mobilized its congressional allies, arguing that the administration was throwing away millions of dollars in existing Whitehead infrastructure, investment, and threatening jobs at established manufacturing facilities. Representative Nelson Dingley of Maine, whose district included Bliss Company suppliers, introduced legislation that would have required a minimum 5-year transition period before new torpedo systems could fully replace existing weapons, a delay designed to maintain Whitehead contracts indefinitely. But Whitney had anticipated the resistance. He arranged 4 key members of the Naval Affairs Committees from both House and Senate to witness live fire demonstrations in November 1885. The presentations were carefully orchestrated to maximize political impact. Rather than technical discussions of gyroscopic stability and flywheel mechanics, Whitney focused on simple questions: which torpedo hits its target? Which torpedo keeps our sailors safe? Which torpedo represents responsible stewardship of taxpayer money? The demonstrations were decisive. On November 19, 1885, the House Naval Affairs Committee voted to support Whitney's procurement plan. The Senate Committee followed suit on December 2nd. Congressional appropriations for fiscal year 1886 included funding for the establishment of a Howell torpedo production facility at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and an initial order for 50 operational weapons. For John Howell, after 13 years of struggle, vindication seemed finally at hand. On December 10, 1885, Secretary Whitney personally presented him with the Navy's Distinguished Service Medal, recognizing his extraordinary persistence and technical innovation in developing a weapons system of decisive military value. The ceremony was attended by dozens of naval officers, many of whom had supported Howell during his years in the institutional wilderness. But even in this moment of triumph, warning signs were visible to those paying attention. The congressional appropriations, while significant, were structured to phase in Howell torpedo deployment gradually over several years rather than implementing immediate replacement of Whitehead weapons. Existing Whitehead contracts were honored, and the Bliss Company retained its position as a major naval supplier, though focused on other weapons systems. The political compromise had allowed Howell's torpedo to advance, but had not eliminated the institutional and commercial interests aligned against it. The collapse of John Howell's dreams began not with a dramatic confrontation but with a bureaucratic reshuffling that occurred on March 5, 1889, when Benjamin Harrison assumed the presidency and appointed Benjamin Franklin Tracy as Secretary of the Navy. Tracy, former Army officer with limited naval experience but extensive political connections to New York manufacturing interests, brought a very different philosophy to his position than his predecessor. Tracy's first major policy review concerned the Navy's torpedo program. Production of Howell torpedoes had begun at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1887, and by early 1889, approximately 78 weapons had been manufactured and deployed to various ships of the fleet. Field reports from these deployments were overwhelmingly positive. Commanders praised the weapons' accuracy and reliability, and several captains had written directly to the Navy Department requesting priority allocation of Howell torpedoes for their vessels. But Tracy was unmoved by field reports. On April 23, 1889, he convened a new review board under the leadership of Captain Robley Evans, a politically ambitious officer known for his conservative views on naval innovation and his close relationship with congressional Republicans. Evans was given a specific mandate: evaluate whether the Navy's investment in Howell torpedo production represented the most effective use of limited procurement funds. The Evans Board's methodology was fundamentally flawed from the outset. Rather than conducting new comparative tests, the board relied primarily on theoretical analysis of mechanical reliability and long-term maintenance costs. Evans argued that the Howell torpedo's flywheel mechanism, while innovative, represented a potential maintenance challenge because it required precision machining to tolerances that might be difficult to maintain on ships at sea. The Whitehead torpedo, by contrast, used simpler components that could be more easily serviced by ship crews. This analysis ignored the actual maintenance records from ships equipped with Howell torpedoes, which showed significantly fewer mechanical failures than Whitehead-equipped vessels. It also discounted the safety advantages. Howell torpedoes had experienced zero catastrophic failures or injuries in operational service, while Whitehead torpedoes continued to cause occasional casualties due to compressed air accidents. The Evans Board delivered its report on July 8, 1889, recommending that the Navy reconsider its rapid transition to the Howell torpedo system and maintain a balanced force structure that includes substantial numbers of proven Whitehead weapons. The report's language was careful and technical, but its practical effect was clear: halt the expansion of Howell torpedo production and resume large-scale Whitehead purchases. Secretary Tracy accepted the board's recommendations, and on August 1, 1889, issued orders suspending further Howell torpedo procurement pending additional long-term reliability studies. The Brooklyn Navy Yard production facility, which had been preparing to expand operations, was instead directed to shift toward maintenance of existing weapons, rather than production of new ones. John Howell, now 53 years old, and serving as a captain stationed at the Naval War College, learned of Tracy's decision through official channels, but was not consulted before the policy change was implemented. His response in a letter to Admiral Luce dated August 15, 1889, revealed both frustration and resignation. I have spent 17 years proving that my torpedo is superior in every meaningful measure of combat effectiveness. The Navy has accepted this proof in multiple official reviews. Yet political considerations consistently override technical evidence. I begin to wonder whether my efforts serve any purpose. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. In October 1889, Robert Whitehead, now the British inventor of the torpedo that bore his name, introduced a significantly improved version of his weapon featuring a gyroscopic guidance system that dramatically improved its accuracy. The new Whitehead torpedo, designated the Mark III, incorporated principles remarkably similar to those Howell had pioneered, though Whitehead's implementation used a different mechanical approach and was protected by separate patents. The Mark III Whitehead Tornado still used compressed air propulsion, retaining that system's disadvantages, but its improved accuracy narrowed the performance gap with Howell's design. More importantly, from a political perspective, the new Whitehead weapon provided cover for officials who wanted to maintain existing procurement relationships. Secretary Tracy's annual report to Congress in December 1889 argued that recent improvements in Whitehead torpedo technology have diminished the relative advantages of alternative systems, justifying continued reliance on weapons with proven international service records. This reasoning was technically dubious. The Howell torpedo remained more accurate than even the improved Whitehead design and retained substantial advantages in stealth and safety, but it was politically sufficient. Congressional appropriations for fiscal year 1890 included substantial funding for Whitehead Mark III purchases and only minimal allocations for Howell torpedo maintenance. By 1891, production of new Howell torpedoes had effectively ceased. The 78 weapons already manufactured remained in service, and ships equipped with them continued to report superior performance, but no new production orders were issued. The Brooklyn Navy Yard facility that had been established specifically for Howell torpedo manufacturing was converted to other uses. The institutional preference for Whitehead torpedoes became further entrenched with the establishment of the torpedo station at Newport, Rhode Island in 1892. The facility was designed around Whitehead weapon specifications, with storage, maintenance, and testing infrastructure optimized for compressed air systems. Accommodating Howell torpedoes would have required separate, parallel systems and expense that Navy planners deemed unjustifiable for a weapon that was no longer in production. The Spanish-American War erupted on April 21, 1898, providing the first real test of American naval power since the Civil War and the final tragic validation of John Howell's warnings. The conflict would demonstrate with brutal clarity the consequences of the Navy's decision to reject the superior weapon that had been offered to them 2 decades earlier. During the war's opening phases, American naval forces achieved quick victories at Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba, but these successes owed more to Spanish incompetence and American numerical superiority than to the effectiveness of American torpedoes. In fact, torpedo attacks during the war were remarkably ineffective. At the Battle of Santiago on July 3, 1898, American ships fired 27 Whitehead torpedoes at the fleeing Spanish fleet. According to official Navy Department action reports from the engagement, only 2 torpedoes struck their targets, an accuracy rate of 7%, even worse than testing had predicted. The most disturbing aspect of these failures was that several Spanish vessels might have been destroyed rather than merely damaged if more effective torpedoes had been available. The Spanish cruiser Cristobal Colon, the fastest ship in the Spanish fleet, was eventually overtaken and forced to beach herself after hours of pursuit, but she might have been sunk quickly by accurate torpedo fire in the engagement's early stages. The extended chase allowed the ship's crew to destroy sensitive documents and equipment, intelligence that might have proven valuable. Captain Howell, now 62 years old and assigned to shore duty due to his age, watched these events with profound sadness. In a letter to Admiral George Dewey, hero of Manila Bay, dated July 29, 1898, Howell wrote, "The Spanish War has demonstrated what I have been saying for 20 years. Our torpedoes are inadequate. For actual combat conditions, we have won despite our weapons, not because of them. Against a more capable adversary, these failures might have cost us dearly." The 78 Howell torpedoes still in service performed far better than their Whitehead counterparts during the war. Ships equipped with Howell weapons reported an 81% accuracy rate in combat, conditions consistent with peacetime testing. The USS Vesuvius, a specialized torpedo ship carrying 6 Howell torpedoes, successfully struck 5 out of 6 targets during bombardment operations at Santiago. But these successes went largely unremarked in official reports, overshadowed by the larger narrative of American victory. After the war, the Navy conducted extensive after-action reviews to identify lessons learned and equipment deficiencies. The torpedo performance issues were documented in painstaking detail reports from ship captains, analysis of expenditure rates versus results achieved, and honest assessments of tactical effectiveness. The Review Board's final report, completed in February 1899, acknowledged that torpedo performance during the Spanish War fell significantly short of peacetime expectations and training standards. But the report stopped short of recommending any fundamental change in torpedo procurement policy. By this point, the Whitehead torpedo had become so deeply embedded in Navy infrastructure, training, and doctrine that shifting to an alternative system would have required massive institutional effort. The review board instead recommended improved training, refined tactics, and continued work to enhance Whitehead reliability recommendations that addressed symptoms rather than the fundamental problem. John Howell retired from the Navy in June 1899 after 37 years of service. He received the customary honors and a pension commensurate with his rank, but no special recognition for his torpedo work beyond the Medal Secretary Whitney had presented 14 years earlier. The official naval history published in 1900 mentioned the Howell torpedo only in passing, describing it as an experimental weapon system that showed promise but was not adopted for widespread deployment. The final irony arrived in 1904, when the Russo-Japanese War provided a devastating demonstration of what might have been. At the Battle of Tsushima, on May 27th and 28th, 1905, the Japanese Navy, which had continued to develop and refine advanced torpedo technology, achieved devastating results against the Russian fleet. Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats, attacking at night and in conditions of limited visibility, sank or crippled multiple Russian capital ships with torpedo attacks that achieved accuracy rates exceeding 70%. American naval observers attending the battle were stunned by the Japanese torpedo performance. Commander William Sims, who would later become a prominent admiral, filed a report noting that Japanese torpedoes appeared to run true and wakeless, the accuracy far exceeding that of American or European weapons. What Sims didn't know, what few American officers knew, was that Japanese torpedo development had been heavily influenced by the Howell design that their delegation had studied back in 1880. While Japan had not acquired manufacturing rights for the Howell torpedo itself, Japanese engineers had incorporated several of Howell's key innovations into their own weapons development. The Type 6 torpedo, which equipped Japanese forces at Tsushima, used a modified flywheel stabilization system that produced minimal wake and achieved accuracy rates that astonished Western naval observers. The weapon's performance characteristics were remarkably similar to those John Howell had demonstrated at Newport Harbor 28 years earlier. Captain Haihachiro Togo, who commanded the Japanese fleet at Tsushima and had been part of that 1880 delegation to Washington, later wrote in his memoirs, "The American Torpedo Inventor." Howell showed us that accuracy and stealth were achievable through mechanical innovation rather than merely through operator skill. Though we developed our own solutions to the technical challenges, his work illuminated the path forward. It is regrettable that his own Navy did not follow that path. John Alexander Howell died on November 15, 1918, at his home in Middletown, Rhode Island, at the age of 82. His obituary in the New York Times, published 2 days later, was brief and focused primarily on his Civil War service and his later administrative roles. The torpedo that bore his name received a single sentence. Amel Howell also invented a torpedo device that saw limited naval use in the late 19th century. The 78 Howell torpedoes that had been manufactured remained in Navy inventory until they were finally retired and scrapped in 1912, their flywheel mechanisms salvaged for scrap metal. No museum preserved a complete example, a loss that naval historians would later lament. Today, only fragments remain, technical drawings in the National Archives, single corroded flywheel assembly in the Smithsonian storage facilities, and scattered references in official reports and personal correspondence. The broader lessons of the Howell torpedo affair took decades to fully appreciate. Naval historians examining the procurement decisions of the late 19th century consistently identify the rejection of Howell's weapon as a case study in how institutional politics, commercial interests, and bureaucratic inertia can override technical merit. The weapon was 16 times more accurate than the Whitehead torpedoes the Navy purchased, instead a performance gap so enormous that it should have made the procurement decision obvious. Yet for nearly 30 years, from Howell's first demonstrations in 1877 until well into the early 20th century, the Navy persisted with inferior weapons. The consequences were measurable: lower combat effectiveness during the Spanish-American War, wasted expenditures on weapons with high failure rates, and unnecessary casualties from compressed air accidents that the Howell torpedo's design had eliminated. Modern military procurement specialists studying the Howell case identify multiple factors that contributed to the weapon's rejection. Political considerations, the influence of the E.W. Bliss Company, and its congressional allies played an obvious role. Institutional conservatism and resistance to unfamiliar technology also mattered. Naval officers trained on Whitehead systems were naturally reluctant to embrace fundamental changes to doctrine and procedure. International factors weighed as well. Adopting a uniquely American torpedo meant diverging from European practice at a time when American naval planners were still learning from more established European powers. But perhaps the most significant factor was simply timing and presentation. Howell's torpedo arrived during a period when the Navy was already committed to the Whitehead system, with infrastructure investments made and training programs established. The superior performance of his weapon, while documented beyond any reasonable doubt, could not overcome the momentum of existing commitments. By the time political leadership emerged that was willing to challenge those commitments, Secretary Whitney's tenure from 1885 to 1889, the window of opportunity was brief and closed quickly when the political winds shifted again. The Howell torpedo story resonates beyond its immediate historical context because it illustrates a persistent challenge in military innovation, how to ensure that technological superiority translates into procurement and deployment. Numerous examples from later eras echo the same patterns: superior weapon systems, sidelined by political considerations, bureaucratic resistance, or simple institutional inertia. The pattern repeated with aircraft designs, radar systems, and countless other technologies where technical merit proved insufficient to overcome non-technical obstacles. For John Howell himself, the torpedo represented more than just an invention. It was a mission born from personal tragedy and pursued with remarkable persistence across nearly 4 decades. He had watched his weapon prove itself in demonstration after demonstration, seen its superiority documented in official review after official review, yet witnessed the institution he served choose the inferior alternative time and again. The frustration must have been profound, but so too must have been the satisfaction of knowing that history would eventually vindicate his technical judgment, even if that vindication came too late to matter. The men who might have benefited most from Howell's invention were the ordinary sailors who handled torpedoes, loaded them into tubes, and depended on them in combat. These men never knew that a safer, more effective weapon had been available and rejected. They worked with the compressed air systems that occasionally exploded, killing or injuring their shipmates. They launched torpedoes that veered off course or dove too deep, leaving enemy ships undamaged and their own vessels vulnerable to counterattack. They died in battles that might have been won more easily and with fewer casualties if their weapons had performed as well as Howell's torpedo could have performed. This ultimately was the true cost of the Navy's decision, a cost measured not in dollars or procurement efficiency, but in the lives and effectiveness. The men who went to sea with inferior weapons because their service chose political convenience over combat capability. The decision to refuse John Howell's torpedo may have made sense to the secretaries, admirals, and congressmen who made it. But it made no sense at all to the sailors whose lives depended on having the best weapons their nation could provide. And so the Howell torpedo passed into history, a technological triumph that became a cautionary tale. A weapon 16 times deadlier than its alternative that was rejected not because it didn't work, but because it worked too differently from what the institution was prepared to accept. Its story remains relevant more than a century later, a reminder that excellence alone is rarely sufficient to overcome the combined forces of politics, commerce, and institutional resistance to change.